The river runs quietly this morning, as though it has been keeping a secret for many years. A pale, almost colorless light lies across its surface, and the willows lean their narrow fingers toward the water, brushing the current with an unhurried tenderness. Somewhere along the bank, a path curves toward the edge, and on that path there is the faint trace of footsteps that will not return. A coat, lined with stones, sinks below the surface, and the ripples close over it as if nothing at all has happened. Good evening, dear listener, or perhaps good morning, or the still hour before the day begins in your part of the world. You are here in the Scandal Archives vault, where the past breathes slowly and speaks in its own time. I wonder where you are listening from, whether there is a lamp beside you, or the dim glow of a phone screen, or simply the dark. Leave a trace in the comments, so that this circle of memory might grow across oceans and years. And if you will, press the small button that keeps this channel alive, so that we can keep walking together through the corridors of time. Tonight, or today, we follow the life of Virginia Woolf, the haunted genius, whose mind was both a lantern and a labyrinth. It is the 28th day of March, in the year 1941, and the air has the smell of thawing earth. The world is not yet green, but the frost has loosened its hold, and a pale mist rests over the Ouse, as if it has been waiting for her. She rises early, perhaps earlier than Leonard notices, though he would have been watching her closely these days. The war has pulled the mornings thin, and the quiet is pierced only by the occasional rumble of a distant aircraft. In the small house at Rodmell, the rooms still smell faintly of the night's fire, the kindling burned down to a soft bed of ash. Virginia moves with a measured slowness, the way one does when the body is already certain of its path. A coat is chosen, not the warmest, but one with deep pockets. She selects the stones carefully, each with its own cool weight, as though there is a kind of ritual in their choosing. On the desk in her writing room lies the letter, folded, sealed, still carrying the damp shine of ink. The pen rests nearby, the nib darkened by the last word she will write. The road to the river is quiet. She would have known every hedge, every bend in the path, the way the light fell differently depending on the season. Today, the sky is overcast, but not unfriendly. The bare branches of the willows quiver in a breeze too soft to trouble the water. She steps onto the bank and pauses, as if listening, not to the war, not to the house she has left behind, but to the murmuring of the river itself. One might think, if one passed her on that path, that she was simply a woman taking a walk, perhaps thinking over a sentence, or a memory, or a small task to be done later. But there is no one to pass her today. The war has emptied the countryside of its idle wanderers. The fields are the domain of laborers and soldiers, not the flaneurs of gentler times. She is alone with the water, and the water alone with her. I cannot tell you what she thought in that moment, for the truth of it is sealed away, and all we have are the traces she left in words, the letter to Leonard, the final fragment of thought. But I imagine she may have felt the pull of two currents at once, the one that carried her through the years of writing, and the other that whispered of rest. In her fiction, rivers often carry voices, memories, and the shifting of time. Now, the river becomes the final reader of her story. The stones are heavy but not cumbersome. She slips them into the pockets with care, feeling the tug against her coat, the way the seams tighten under the strain. Perhaps she takes one last breath of the air above the bank, a breath full of damp earth and waterweed, before stepping in. The Ouse is not a fierce river. It does not rush to claim her. It folds around her slowly, its coldness rising like a measured sigh. The surface holds for a moment, then closes. It would be hours before Leonard begins to fear the absence is not a passing walk. He will see the note on the table. He will read the words, quiet words, practical even in their sorrow, and he will know the weight they carry. And in that moment, the house will seem unbearably still. But here, by the water, there is no announcement, no witness but the willows and the small eddies circling away from the point where she disappeared. The sound is not of drowning, but of a stone dropped into a deep well, swift, silent, and without echo. Years before, she had written of a character who walks into a river, her pockets filled, her steps deliberate. Fiction had given her a way to imagine the moment. Now, the page and the day meet. Perhaps that is the only way such a life could end, not with a sudden act, but with a gesture already rehearsed in thought and art, as though the mind had been preparing the body for years. It is tempting for those of us who look back to search for the signs, to gather the scattered hints in her diaries and novels, to tell ourselves the ending was inevitable. But life is never only a chain of causes. It is also the small hesitations, the brief returns, the days when the current pulls one way and then another. In the weeks before this morning, there were moments of laughter, of conversation, of shared work at the press. These do not cancel the darker tide, they coexist with it. If we were to stand here now, decades later, the river would look the same. Its surface would give no sign of what it once held. The reeds would still sway, the willows would still bend, the current would still carry its slow burden toward the sea. And perhaps that is why we return to this image, not to seek an answer, but to feel the shape of the moment as it lingers in the air, like the scent of rain that has not yet fallen. The letter remains. Its words are preserved, read and reread by strangers across the years. Though they were meant for one pair of hands alone, they are practical, even as they speak of despair. She writes of being certain this time, of knowing she cannot go on. Yet there is also a deep tenderness in the address, in the care for the one who will remain. It is a farewell that carries not only the finality of loss, but the enduring presence of love. And so, the river holds her, the morning passes, and the day moves on without her. In London, the war continues. The papers fill with news of battles and bombings, and the name of Virginia Woolf has not yet reached the pages. The ooze keeps its silence. There's a detail I cannot help but return to. The ink of the letter, still damp when she left the house, the way it might have glistened faintly in the gray light, as though the words themselves had not yet settled into the page. That is where we must leave her, for now, in the space between the letter and the river, between the ink and the water. The moment holds, suspended, waiting for us to return to it. The ink is still damp, glistening faintly as though reluctant to settle into the fibers of the paper, and in that shimmer lies another time, another room. The air smells not of river water and earth, but of old varnished wood and the faint dust of books that have not been moved for years. The window panes rattle with the wind off the sea, though the house itself seems to hold its breath, keeping its own counsel. This is Hyde Park Gate in Kensington, where Virginia, then still Virginia Stephen, spent the early years of her life, under a roof that felt at once expansive and enclosed. It is a house of many rooms, each with its own temperature, its own quality of light. The drawing room in the afternoon is golden with the sun slanting in through tall windows, the parquet floor holding the day's warmth like a memory. But the corridors are dim, lined with family portraits whose painted eyes seem to follow the children as they pass. There is the library, heavy with the smell of leather bindings and the faint tang of ink, where her father, Leslie Stephen, works in the silence that can either comfort or oppress, depending on one's mood. Her mother, Julia, is a presence of both calm and energy, moving through the house with the unhurried assurance of someone whose life seems built upon a certain unshakable order. She brings light into a room not by intention, but by the natural force of her presence. To young Virginia, her mother is not merely a figure to be loved. She's the axis around which the household turns, the unspoken reference point for all that is safe and constant. And yet, even in these earliest memories, there are shadows that lengthen at the edges. The house is full of people, siblings, half-siblings, servants, and yet there are moments when silence presses in so closely it becomes a living thing. Sometimes it arrives after the door closes on a conversation not meant for her ears. Sometimes it lingers after the memory of a sharp word or a hurried step fades. Virginia is a quiet child, though not timid. She listens more than she speaks, and she remembers. She observes the way the light in the hallway changes as the day passes, the way her father's tread sounds different when he is deep in thought. She learns that the world inside the house and the world beyond the windows are not the same, and that both are worth watching. There are days when the family gathers for readings or conversations, when the air feels full and generous. Leslie speaks of literature and philosophy. Guests arrive with news of the world beyond Hyde Park Gate. In these moments, the house feels like a center from which all things radiate. But there are other days, too, when Virginia retreats to the corners, her mind weaving together scraps of overheard talk and glimpses of the street outside, into private stories. Her earliest joys are often small ones: the texture of a page beneath her fingers, the discovery of a new word whose sound pleases her mouth, the faint rustle of leaves in the garden beyond the windows. Books are not yet the lifeline they will become, but they are already a quiet and constant presence. The sea is part of her earliest sense of the world, though the family's St. Ives house in Cornwall is a place reached only during certain months. In London, the sea exists in her imagination, brought to life in her mother's voice or in her own daydreams. But the house on Hyde Park Gate has its own kind of tide, a rhythm of mornings and evenings, of arrivals and departures, of voices rising and falling like waves. In the evenings, as the lamps are lit and the outside world recedes, there is sometimes a sense of the house folding inward, each room becoming more itself. The shadows deepen, the fire settles into embers, and the air takes on that peculiar stillness that belongs only to night. It's in such hours that Virginia begins to sense the fragility of things, that even the most solid walls and the most habitual routines can be altered without warning. This knowledge will not take its full shape until the first great absence arrives. When Julia dies in 1895, Virginia is 13, and the house changes overnight. The corridors feel longer, the light seems thinner, and the air carries a heaviness that cannot be swept away. The rhythms of the household falter, and the center that held it steady is gone. Grief comes not as a single blow, but as a tide that advances and retreats, leaving behind both emptiness and salt. Virginia feels it in the way her father moves through the rooms, slower, more burdened, and in the way conversation dims, as though everyone is afraid of breaking something fragile. She feels it too, in herself, a shifting of the ground beneath her, a new awareness of how suddenly life can alter its shape. The house becomes a place of both comfort and confinement. It shelters her, but it also holds her in the echo of what has been lost. There are moments when she walks the corridors and feels she is moving through a kind of museum, each object holding a ghost of the life before. Even the sound of the front door closing behind a visitor feels different now, a reminder of absence rather than the promise of return. It is in this altered world that the seeds of her later work take root. The layering of time, the way past and present can occupy the same space without touching. These are not yet ideas she can name, but they are sensations she carries with her. She begins to sense that memory is not something one keeps in a locked drawer, but something that moves through the air, as real as the dust motes that float in the afternoon light. And yet, life does not stop. The house still hums with small daily activities, the clink of cups in the kitchen, the scratching of a pen at her father's desk, the creak of stairs as someone goes up or down. There is still the scent of tea in the late afternoons, the flicker of lamplight across familiar walls. But there is always, somewhere in the background, that sound of the clock in the hallway, marking the hours without pause, as if to remind them all that time is moving on, whether or not they are ready. It is this sound, the steady, patient ticking, that will stay with her long after she has left Hyde Park Gate. Even when the house is no more than a memory, she will hear it in moments of stillness, as if it were marking the distance between what was and what is. The ink on the letter has dried by now, somewhere far in the future, but here, in this remembered house, there are pages still to be written. Virginia is not yet the woman who will walk to the Euse. She is still the girl who listens for footsteps in the hall, who notices the particular way the light falls on the banister in late afternoon. And yet, even now, there are moments when she stands at the window, looking out onto the quiet street, and feels the same pull she will one day feel by the river, the sense that there is something just beyond the edge of sight, waiting for her to step toward it. The clock in the hallway ticks on. The curtains shift in a faint draft. Somewhere, a door closes softly, and the sound seems to echo longer than it should. The door closes softly, the latch clicking into place with a sound so small it might be mistaken for the settling of wood in the night. Yet it lingers, as if the air in the hallway holds onto it, carrying it down the long corridor where the light fades into a pale gray. In that dimness, the walls seem taller, the portraits more watchful, and each shadow stretches farther than it ought to. Virginia is 13 when her mother's absence becomes more than a silence in the rooms. It becomes a kind of presence, a ghost without shape or face, woven into the fibers of the house itself. Julia had gone quickly, an illness seizing her in a matter of days, and there had been no long goodbye, no gradual fading. One moment the rhythm of the household had been intact. The next, it had fallen apart like a clock whose spring has suddenly snapped. The corridors grow colder after that. The fire is lit each evening, but the warmth does not seem to move beyond the hearth. Her father's study door stays closed for long stretches, and when it opens, the man who emerges is older than he had been just a month before. His tread is heavier, the set of his shoulders more stooped, and though he still speaks to the children, his voice carries the weight of someone talking through a veil. It is in these weeks that Virginia begins to understand how grief can come in waves. The first is sharp, breaking suddenly and leaving her breathless. Then there is the strange stillness between one wave and the next, when life seems almost ordinary again, until the next swell rises and the water closes over her head. These are not the rhythms of the sea she had known in St. Ives, with its dependable tides. This is a sea that shifts without warning, that can be calm one moment and treacherous the next. At night, when the house has gone quiet, she lies awake, listening for sounds that will not come. The light, quick steps of her mother moving between rooms, the murmur of her voice in conversation, the faint clink of glass in the distance. She imagines she hears them sometimes, but when she lifts her head, there's only the sound of the clock in the hallway, patient and unhurried, marking the hours she cannot yet fill with sleep. Her half-sister Stella steps into the role of caretaker with a grace that feels almost like their mother's. Stella is calm and steady, her presence a bridge between the chaos of loss and the slow return of daily life. Virginia looks to her often, not just for comfort, but for a sense of what might still be possible in a world where the most constant figure can vanish overnight. But even this fragile stability is brief. Stella, too, will be taken, married, then suddenly gone, claimed by illness before the year has turned. Two losses in such close company leave Virginia adrift, her sense of the world's reliability stripped away. The rooms seem emptier now, not only for the absence of voices, but for the absence of what those voices once promised, that people would remain, that their presence could be counted on. It is in this hollowed-out time that the first shadows of her later illness begin to move toward her. They arrive not as violent storms, but as subtle distortions, colors too bright, thoughts that circle endlessly, a sense of herself loosening from the solid world around her. Days blur into one another. At times she cannot bear to read, though books have always been her refuge. At others she reads compulsively, as though the act of moving her eyes over the printed page could anchor her. Her siblings notice, though they do not yet have the language for it. They see her withdraw, then return suddenly with bursts of energy, then vanish into herself again. The doctors speak of rest and fresh air, of avoiding strain on the nerves, but Virginia begins to suspect that what has changed in her is not something that can be mended by sunlight or a holiday. It is as though some door inside her mind has been left ajar, and she cannot always close it against what drifts in. There are still moments of brightness. Visits to St. Ives bring the salt wind and the expanse of the sea, and for a time the horizon steadies her. The light on the water in the late afternoon is something she will carry for the rest of her life, returning to it in memory and on the page. In those days she walks along the shore, her thoughts stretching out to match the distance of the waves. But the return to London always brings with it a narrowing of space, a sense of walls drawing closer. In the absence of her mother and Stella, the household rearranges itself. Vanessa, the eldest sister, takes on a central role, her quiet strength a counterbalance to the shifts in their father's moods. Thoby and Adrian, her brothers, grow into their own pursuits, but Virginia feels herself inhabiting a different kind of space, not quite separate from them, yet not entirely within the same frame. She is present at meals, at conversations, yet often finds her mind pulling away toward some inner landscape. It is during these years that she begins to write more deliberately, not simply as a pastime, but as a way to fix the shifting shapes of thought before they dissolve. Her early efforts are private, confined to diaries and sketches, but even then there's a rhythm to them, a sense that she is trying to capture not just events, but the texture of how they are experienced. She notices how memory can alter the light in a room, how grief can make the air heavier, how joy can sharpen the edges of sound. Still, the shadows remain close. There are days when the sound of the clock in the hallway seems unbearably loud, when she cannot step into the sunlight without feeling as though the air itself is pressing against her skin. On those days, the house feels like a labyrinth, each room leading only to another room, with no door that opens onto the wide world. In time, she will come to speak of these early breakdowns as episodes, but that word does not capture the slow, indistinct way they arrive, or the lingering fog they leave behind. They are not storms that pass cleanly, but weather that settles into the bones. And yet, even in these moments, she is gathering something, an understanding perhaps, of how the mind can fracture and still observe itself, of how life can continue in the midst of loss without ever quite returning to what it was. This knowledge will not be a comfort, but it will become part of the language she carries forward. The door at the end of the hallway opens suddenly, and light spills in from another room. A figure passes, the sound of footsteps soft on the carpet. For a moment, Virginia thinks of rising to follow, but she remains still, listening as the steps fade. The clock ticks on, and the shadow of the door frame stretches across the floor, slow and deliberate. Somewhere, outside the reach of the gaslight, the curtains move in a faint wind. The curtains move in that faint wind, their fabric breathing in and out as if the room itself has lungs. The lamplight shivers across the folds, and shadows ripple over the walls, distorting the familiar lines of the furniture. Virginia lies awake in her bed, her eyes following the slow sway as though it were a pendulum marking not time but thought. The air is cool, carrying the mingled scents of coal smoke from the street and the faint salt that seems to cling to her even in London, as if the sea refuses to release her entirely. In these hours between midnight and dawn, the house becomes something else. The walls loosen their grip on the day's events, and the quiet is so complete that it begins to hum faintly, as though silence itself has a sound. She thinks of the rooms beyond her own, the closed doors, the sleeping bodies, the strange fact that life continues even when unseen. Perhaps it is in this stillness that she begins to understand the kind of solitude she will need. Not the solitude of isolation, but the solitude of a mind left free to wander its own corridors without interruption. By day, she is still a girl in a household whose rhythms are governed by others. Lessons take place at home, as they always have. She has no formal schooling in the way her brothers do, yet she does not resent this entirely. It gives her time to devour the books that line the shelves in her father's library, books that carry her far beyond Hyde Park Gate. History, philosophy, fiction, poetry. She moves between them with the hunger of someone discovering new rooms in a house she had thought she knew. Sometimes she reads aloud to herself, testing the weight of each sentence in her mouth. She notices how some words settle into the air and linger, while others fall away almost at once. This is not yet the deliberate craftsmanship of a writer at work, but it is a kind of apprenticeship, as if her mind is quietly learning the architecture of language while she reads. Her father, when in a generous mood, allows her the run of the library, though there is always the unspoken understanding that these books are his domain. She has learned to tread lightly in that space, to speak softly, to touch the spines with a reverence that is both genuine and strategic. The room smells of paper and pipe smoke, and the afternoon light slants in through the tall windows, catching dust motes in its path. It is a place of order and quiet, yet she knows it is not truly hers. The rest of the house hums with domestic activity, voices in the kitchen, the creak of floorboards as someone moves about upstairs, the muffled sounds from the street beyond the windows. There is no corner entirely her own, no place where she can close the door and claim the air as hers. She writes at a small table in her bedroom when she can, but there's always the possibility of intrusion, the quick knock and the voice calling her name before the door opens. It is in these scraps of private time that she begins to keep a diary. The entries are irregular, sometimes only a few lines, but they are a way of speaking without interruption. She writes not only about events, but about the texture of moments, the way a shaft of light fell across the breakfast table, the particular silence that followed a remark no one knew how to answer. She is, without quite realizing it, training herself to notice, to hold an instant in the mind long enough to set it down in words. Her siblings drift in and out of her days. Vanessa is often occupied with her own work, sketching or painting in a light-filled room that seems to breathe differently from the rest of the house. Thoby, tall and easy in his movements, brings the outside world into the home with his stories of friends and lectures. Adrian, younger and still finding his shape, moves between the others with a kind of fluidity. Virginia observes them all, not as a detached outsider, but as someone gathering pieces of a shared life, knowing that each will carry their own version of these days. Evenings often bring the company of visitors, writers, artists, family friends. Virginia listens from the edges, absorbing the rhythm of their speech, the way conversation moves like a tide, pulling certain voices to the fore before receding again. She's drawn to the moments between the main exchanges, when someone's glance lingers a fraction too long, or a sentence trails off unfinished. These are the places where meaning often hides, and she learns to catch it before it slips away. There are still days when her mind falters, when the air seems too dense, when thoughts circle without moving forward. On such days, she retreats into books with the desperation of someone seeking shelter from a storm. The printed page offers a kind of solidity the world outside does not. The words do not change their shape when she looks away and back again. And yet, she's beginning to imagine something beyond reading and observation. The small pieces she writes, sketches, impressions, fragments, are starting to take on a life of their own. She does not yet think of them as work. They are more like a private correspondence with herself, a way of mapping the territory of her own mind. But there is a pull in them, a faint suggestion that they could become something larger, something that might reach beyond these walls. Sometimes, late at night, she writes by candlelight, the wax pooling at the base while the nib of her pen scratches steadily across the paper. The flame flickers in the draft from the moving curtains, casting shadows that dance across her hands. She writes until the letters blur, until the words begin to drift toward dreams. The act is quiet, almost secretive, yet it feels essential, as though each line she sets down is a step toward some unknown door. The sea is never far from her mind. Even in the heart of London, she hears it in memory, the rush and retreat of the waves at St. Ives, the long horizon that makes the present moment feel both infinite and fragile. She begins to sense that the sea is a kind of language in itself, one she might one day translate into words. For now, she remains in this house, in this life of shared rooms and borrowed time. She has not yet found the space that will be entirely her own, the place where the door can close without apology. But she's learning how to carry such a room within her, how to carve it out of hours rather than walls. The curtains shift again, their movement catching the light just so, and for a moment, the shadow on the wall looks like the outline of an open door. She watches it until it changes, until it is only fabric once more, breathing in the night air. Somewhere beyond the house, beyond the city, the sea moves against the shore, and its rhythm is not unlike the steady ticking of the hallway clock. She sets down her pen, the ink still glistening on the page, and leans back in her chair. The sound of footsteps rises from below, familiar, unhurried, approaching along the corridor. The footsteps in the corridor are unhurried, deliberate, drawing closer with a rhythm that seems to belong to another part of the day entirely. They pass her door without pause, fading toward the staircase, and a moment later she hears the muted murmur of voices below. The sound carries differently now, less confined by the thick walls of Hyde Park Gate, as if already slipping toward another kind of space. It is in the years after her father's death, in 1904, that the center of her world begins to shift. The house that had been both fortress and cage is given up, its familiar corridors and watchful portraits left behind. Virginia, Vanessa, Thoby, and Adrian move together to a house in Bloomsbury, a place that feels lighter from the first moment they step inside. The rooms are plainer, the ceilings lower, and yet the air is somehow more generous, as though it has been waiting for them. The streets around Gordon Square carry a different rhythm from Kensington. Here, the sound is not of carriages passing under the weight of formality, but of footsteps moving quickly over uneven pavement, of shop shutters rolling open, of conversations spilling from pubs and tea rooms. The light is sharper, less filtered through the layers of expectation that seem to press upon their old home. Even the air smells different, less of polished wood and more of coal smoke mixed with the faint tang of fresh paint from neighboring houses. It is in this new space that Virginia begins to feel the stirrings of a different life, one in which the boundaries between work, conversation, and friendship blur into something richer. Visitors come and go with a freedom that would have been unthinkable under her father's watch. In the evenings, the rooms fill with the voices of artists, writers, philosophers, people who seem to speak without the invisible weight of propriety pressing down upon their words. Thoby, tall and magnetic, draws friends from Cambridge, men whose talk ranges from politics to art to the nature of truth itself. Lytton Strachey, with his sharp wit and unflinching opinions. Clive Bell, already in Vanessa's orbit. Leonard Woolf, thoughtful and precise, though at this stage only an occasional presence. The gatherings are informal, the conversation sometimes sprawling and chaotic, yet always alive. Virginia listens as much as she speaks, her mind catching on certain turns of phrase, certain ideas that seem to open new doors inside her. There's a looseness here, a willingness to question the structures that once seemed immovable. The talk is often bold, but it is not the boldness of posturing. It is the boldness of curiosity, of people who believe that thought itself can be shaped and reshaped like clay. For Virginia, this is not merely a change of company, it is a change of atmosphere, as though the air itself in Bloomsbury carries more oxygen for the mind. Her own writing begins to take on a new energy in this environment. She is still finding her form, experimenting with essays and reviews, pieces that allow her to test the interplay between observation and rhythm. The work is demanding, but it feels less like labor and more like a form of listening to the world around her, to the movement of thought within her own mind. The house itself becomes a kind of shared creation. Vanessa fills the walls with her paintings. The furniture is chosen not for its adherence to convention, but for its comfort and the way it suits the flow of conversation. The table might be cluttered with papers one day and cleared for a meal the next, the boundaries between the domestic and the intellectual dissolving without ceremony. There are moments, of course, when the old shadows return. The movement from one world to another does not erase the weight she sometimes carries in her mind. There are days when the noise of the street feels too sharp, when the very openness of the rooms feels like exposure rather than freedom. Yet these moments are met here with a different kind of response. Not the hush of a household unwilling to speak of such things, but the quiet acceptance of friends who understand that the mind, like the weather, shifts. The seasons turn in Bloomsbury, each bringing its own texture to the days. In winter, the rooms are warmed by the glow of the fire, the air thick with tobacco smoke and the scent of tea. In spring, the square outside softens with the new leaves, and the light through the windows grows longer, lingering into the evenings when the conversations stretch toward midnight. The sound of the city changes with the seasons too, sharper in winter, more diffuse in summer, always carrying the low hum of life beyond the walls. Virginia begins to walk more in these years, exploring the streets of London with the attentiveness she once reserved for the corridors of her childhood home. She notices how the light falls differently in Fitzrovia than it does along the Thames, how the sound of footsteps changes depending on the paving beneath them. These walks feed her writing in ways she cannot yet fully name. They give her a sense of the city as a living organism, each part connected to the others through unseen currents. Even the smallest details seem to invite her attention. The way a shopkeeper arranges the goods in the window, the glint of rain on cobblestones, the brief exchange between strangers passing in the street. These fragments, stored away without conscious effort, will one day surface in her work, stitched into the fabric of her sentences so subtly that they seem inevitable. It is in Bloomsbury that she begins to imagine a life in which writing is not an occupation fitted into the corners of the day, but the day's true center. The thought is both exhilarating and unsettling. To give oneself over entirely to the work is to risk being consumed by it, and already she senses that her mind is not a landscape of gentle slopes, but of sudden drops and unexpected currents. Yet the risk is part of the pull. It is what makes the work feel alive. Sometimes, late in the evening, when the others have gone to bed and the last embers are cooling in the grate, she sits alone in the quiet of the house, listening to the faint sounds of the city beyond the square. A carriage wheel rattles over loose stones. Somewhere a door closes with a hollow thud. The wind moves through the bare branches outside, carrying with it the scent of distant rain. In these moments, she feels the same blend of solitude and connection that will become central to her writing, the sense of being both inside and outside the world at once. The city waits beyond the square, vast and unknowable, yet somehow intimate. It offers her something the old house never could, the possibility of moving freely, of stepping from one street into another and finding herself in a completely new landscape. The doors of London are not all locked, and she's beginning to understand how to open them. In the darkness of the empty room, the floor creaks softly as she rises from her chair. The fire has gone out, and the air is cool against her skin. She crosses to the window and looks out over the square, where the street lamps cast their yellow light on the damp pavement. Somewhere out there, just beyond the edge of sight, a voice calls faintly, then fades into the hum of the city. The voice fades into the hum of the city, dissolving among the countless other sounds that drift upward into the night. Cartwheels groaning over the uneven street, the distant bark of a dog, the faint rush of wind funneling between narrow buildings. She stands at the window for a moment longer, her fingers resting lightly on the cool glass, and feels the strange, weightless sensation of being suspended between the intimacy of the room behind her and the immensity of the city beyond. In that space between, her thoughts begin to gather, slow and deliberate, as though they have been waiting for the stillness to take shape. These are the years when her writing begins to demand more from her. No longer simply exercises or experiments. Her work now presses against the edges of her mind, shaping and reshaping the way she moves through the day. She wakes thinking of sentences, of rhythms, of how light might be carried in words. She falls asleep hearing the quiet rustle of phrases arranging themselves just beyond her conscious reach. Yet this deepening of her craft brings with it a sharpening of the old shadows, as though the mind, drawn into such concentration, begins to turn in on itself. There are mornings when she rises to her desk with an almost fevered clarity, the words spilling from her hand as if the act of writing is a relief, a release. But there are others when the page remains blank, not because the mind is empty, but because it is too full. Thoughts crowding and overlapping, fragmentary images that refuse to settle into order. On such days, she can feel the weight of her own mind pressing inward, making even the simplest task feel as though it must be undertaken in deep water. The others in the house notice these shifts in her, though they do not always speak of them. Vanessa, with her steady gaze, seems to understand without needing to ask, her presence offering a quiet anchor. Friends come and go, their visits filling the air with talk and laughter, but the undercurrent remains. Virginia herself learns to navigate it, sensing when the tide within her is turning, when she must step carefully to keep from being swept too far in any one direction. The city offers its own medicine, though she would never call it that. Walking through the streets, she finds that the act of moving, past shop fronts, through markets, alongside the endless parade of other lives, loosens the knots in her mind. She observes without judgment, noting the way a child clutches a parent's hand, the way light spills unevenly from an open doorway, the way a newspaper page flutters against the curb in the wind. These observations do not always make their way directly into her writing, but they feed something in her, keeping her tethered to the outer world when the inner one threatens to consume her. She writes essays and reviews, each one a small arena in which to test her developing voice. The discipline of these shorter forms is both a constraint and a liberation. They require her to engage with the work of others, to hold her own mind steady against the current of another's creation. Yet even in these critical pieces, she begins to blur the line between observation and reflection, allowing her own sensibility to color the analysis. It is as if she is practicing for a larger canvas, one on which she might weave thought and sensation into something entirely her own. At times, she wonders about the nature of her own mind, whether it is a tool to be honed or a landscape to be mapped. There are moments when it feels like both, when the act of writing is not so much a task as it is a way of navigating herself. She becomes increasingly aware of the relationship between her mental states and her creative energy, though the connection is far from straightforward. Periods of intense clarity are sometimes followed by abrupt collapses, and it is in the aftermath of these collapses that the shape of the mind reveals itself most starkly. During these downturns, sound becomes sharper, light more intrusive, and the very air seems weighted. The simple act of leaving her room can feel like stepping into a storm. Friends speak of rest, of care, of allowing the mind to recover, but she knows there is no simple cure, only the slow return of balance, like a tide turning after a long, uncertain pause. When the words return, they do so tentatively at first, then with a sudden urgency, as if making up for lost time. And yet, she begins to sense that these cycles, though they bring pain and disruption, are not entirely destructive. There's a strange kind of knowledge to be found in them, an understanding of fragility that informs the texture of her work. She notices how people speak differently when they are on the edge of their own endurance, how their movements slow or quicken, how their eyes search for something unseen. These details find their way into her sentences, not as decoration but as the marrow of the thing she is trying to capture. The Bloomsbury gatherings continue, their conversation a steady pulse through the seasons. Sometimes she is at the center of them, her remarks carrying the room forward. Other times she sits in the quieter corners, letting the voices move around her like water. The group is changing, friendships deepening, romances forming, the patterns of their lives gradually settling into shapes they could not have foreseen when they first began meeting here. Through it all, Virginia's desk remains the fixed point in her own landscape. The papers spread across it shift from drafts to revisions, from notes to finished pieces, but the space itself is constant. It is where the external world and the inner one meet, where the observations gathered on her walks through London are transformed into something that might hold the pulse of a thought long after it has passed. Late one evening, after the others have gone to bed, she sits at that desk, the lamplight pooling over her hands. The street outside is quiet, the wind barely moving the branches in the square. She's writing, not quickly, but with the slow precision of someone placing each word as if it were a stone in a path that must hold her weight. The sound of the pen on the page is the only noise in the room, and it is steady enough to be mistaken for the ticking of a clock. She pauses, lifts her head, and listens. Somewhere, far off, a bell strikes the hour. It's late, though she does not feel tired. The page before her is only half filled, but in its lines there is already the faint outline of something larger, something that will take years to fully emerge, but which has already begun to form in the shadows of her mind. The wind shifts outside, carrying with it a sound she cannot quite place. A fragment of music, perhaps, or the echo of a voice moving away down the street. She sets her pen aside, letting the ink dry, and leans back in her chair. The room is dim now, the lamp's glow having softened into a halo of gold. The city beyond the window seems to breathe, and somewhere in that breathing, a faint rhythm begins to form, one that she knows she will follow, even if it leads her far beyond the safe borders of the page. The rhythm in her mind is faint but insistent, like the distant beat of oars striking water. It doesn't fade when she moves away from the desk. It follows her into sleep, into the fragile light of morning, into the narrow streets of Bloomsbury where the market stalls are being set out, and the air smells of wet vegetables and coal smoke. It is less a melody than a motion, a pull forward, and it seems to gather all her drifting impressions into a single current. In time, she realizes that the current has a destination. It is not yet a book, not yet even a story, but the shadow of a journey. She begins to see it in fragments, faces half lit by an unfamiliar sun, a ship cutting through waves that glitter with a light she cannot name, a city whose streets echo in a language she has never spoken. These pieces do not arrive in order, but they carry the same undertone, the same slow, unbroken movement that feels as though it has been there far longer than she has noticed. She begins to write into it cautiously at first, as one might step into shallow water, testing the strength of the tide. The early pages are uneven, their purpose uncertain, but she does not turn back. With each week, the shape of it becomes clearer, a voyage outward, both literal and inward, toward places that are both foreign and uncannily familiar. The work is not without interruption. Her mind still shifts between days of lucidity and days when clarity dissolves into a kind of dense, unlit fog. The act of writing can feel like hauling a rope hand over hand through that darkness, trusting that something waits at the other end. At times, she leaves the desk for days, only to return as if compelled by an invisible summons. Yet each return brings her deeper into the world she's building, a place whose light and air are entirely her own. The rooms of the Bloomsbury house continue to fill with visitors, with conversations that spill into the night, with a mingled sense of tobacco and tea leaves and damp coats drying near the fire. She listens to them even when she doesn't join in, collecting their cadences, the ways their words gather force or falter. In her mind, she folds these rhythms into the voyage taking shape on her desk, letting them drift into her sentences like sea currents meeting in open water. London itself begins to feel like a harbor, a place from which she can set sail each morning in the quiet of her room, then return in the evening to the sound of wheels on cobblestones, to the flicker of gas lamps catching in the wet leaves of the square. She walks the city differently now, her attention drawn to the departure points, the river quays where cargo is loaded, the railway stations with their platforms shrouded in steam, the sight of a ship's mast far down the Thames. These glimpses feed the texture of her imagined voyage, making it real enough that she can feel the roll of the deck beneath her feet as she writes. The first full draft comes slowly, each page marked with crossings out, with notes in the margins, with entire passages moved and reworked until the ink itself seems tired. But when it's done, she holds the pages in her hands and feels the quiet weight of something that did not exist before, a shape pulled from the formless. She calls it The Voyage Out, and even in that name there is the echo of what she has been chasing, the sense of moving away from the familiar shore into an expanse that cannot yet be measured. Bringing the manuscript into the world is its own journey. She feels the peculiar vulnerability of sending her sentences into other hands, where they will be turned over, weighed, found worthy, or wanting. The wait for responses is long enough to stretch the days thin. When the acceptance comes, it is not triumph she feels first, but a kind of startled quiet, as though the work had been a private tide that she did not entirely expect to reach the open sea. The months before publication carry their own strange tension. She moves through the city, aware that, soon, strangers will carry her words with them, will enter the spaces she has made, will decide for themselves what lives there. In her quieter moments, she wonders whether the voyage she has written will be seen as she sees it, or whether it will shift in the minds of readers into something else entirely. But the question is unanswerable, and in some ways it is the very uncertainty that makes the work feel alive. When the book finally appears in 1915, the world is in the grip of war. The newspapers are filled with casualty lists, with maps marked by shifting front lines, with headlines that swallow the space where art and letters might otherwise appear. And yet, The Voyage Out makes its way into the hands of readers, slowly, quietly, like a ship slipping past the edge of a harbor under cover of mist. Reviews are mixed, as she expects. Some see only the surface of the journey, while others glimpse the undercurrents she had hoped to set in motion. She does not read the reviews obsessively, but they leave their trace on her all the same. Praise feels momentary, evaporating almost as soon as it lands. Criticism lingers, finding small hollows in which to settle. Yet even as the voices of others move around her, the rhythm that began this voyage remains, steady and undiminished, as though it knows there are more shores to reach. In the weeks after publication, she continues to walk through London, past the river, past the narrow streets that open suddenly into wide squares. The city feels both unchanged and subtly altered, as if some private thread between her and it has been acknowledged, even if only in her own mind. She notices details more sharply now. The slant of light on a building's stonework, the shape of a cloud mirrored in a puddle, the way a stranger's voice echoes briefly in the arch of a railway station before fading. At night, she sometimes dreams of the ship in her book, of its decks under unfamiliar stars, of the creak of ropes and the salt wind in her hair. But when she wakes, it is the desk in Bloomsbury that greets her, the stack of fresh pages waiting, the lamp's circle of light ready to hold the next beginning. The voyage she has made on the page does not feel like an ending. It feels like the first clear breath after surfacing from deep water. There is more to write, more to follow, though she doesn't yet know the shapes those journeys will take. One evening, as she sits alone in the dim glow of the sitting room, she hears the faint sound of a printing press from somewhere down the street, its steady clatter carrying through the night air. It reminds her of the mechanical heart of a ship, unseen but constant, pushing forward into the dark. She listens until the sound becomes indistinguishable from her own pulse, then rises and walks to the window. Outside, the street lamps spill their light onto the wet pavement, and the city seems to be waiting. The sound of the printing press drifts through the open window, a steady, deliberate clatter, each turn of the mechanism like the slow beat of an unseen engine. She stands there for a while, watching the way the lamplight catches the slick pavement, and imagines sheets of paper sliding from rollers, still warm with ink, carrying words into the world. She cannot yet see her own hands on such a machine, but the rhythm is already inside her, steadying itself for the years to come. It is in these years, just after the voyage out, that Leonard begins to appear not as a passing figure in the Bloomsbury circle, but as a steady presence. He has returned from service in Ceylon, carrying with him both the stillness of long observation and the habit of careful thought. His voice is measured, his humor dry, his manner at once reserved and attentive. Where others in the group might speak in sudden bursts, leaping from one thought to the next, Leonard's words arrive after a pause. as if he has tested them for weight before setting them down. Their courtship, if it can be called that, does not follow the usual forms. It is less a series of declarations than a gradual alignment, like two rivers converging at an angle so gentle that one hardly notices the change until the waters have fully joined. There are walks, letters, shared meals. They speak of books, of politics, of the work each is trying to shape. There's a kind of safety in his presence, not the safety of shelter from all storms, but the safety of someone who will stand steady in their midst. When they marry in 1912, it is without the weight of elaborate ceremony. The days that follow are not marked by the disruption of honeymoon journeys or grand receptions, but by the quiet settling of a shared life. Their home in Richmond is modest, the room small but filled with light. It is here in 1917 that they decide to purchase a small hand press, a modest piece of equipment that will sit in their dining room and alter the course of both their lives. The Hogarth press is not born from a calculated ambition to dominate the publishing world. It begins as an experiment, a way to bring the act of making books into their own hands, to feel the weight of paper, the smell of ink, the mechanical satisfaction of turning raw materials into finished work. They print by hand, the rollers staining their fingers, the type set letter by letter in neat rows that demand both patience and precision. At first, the press produces small works, pamphlets, short stories, poems, often by friends. The limitations of the machinery impose a natural discipline. Each page must be considered not only for what it says, but for how it will sit on the paper, how the margins will frame it, how the type will stand under the reader's eye. Virginia learns to read her own sentences in this new way, aware now of their physical presence as much as their rhythm. The labor is slow, but there's a pleasure in it, a tangible satisfaction that writing alone cannot always provide. She finds herself listening to the sound of the press as she works, the soft thump of the platen, the faint hiss as a sheet is pulled free, the rustle of stacked pages cooling under their own weight. Each finished book feels less like a commodity and more like a handmade vessel for thought, carrying the care of its makers as surely as the words inside carry their meaning. Their life in Richmond is quieter than Bloomsbury, but not without its own circle of conversation. Friends visit, bringing manuscripts for the press or simply to share the evening. The air here smells less of city smoke and more of damp earth and river water, and on certain days she can feel the light of open fields pressing against the edges of the rooms. She writes in the mornings, the work sometimes flowing with ease, sometimes resisting her hand entirely, but always accompanied by the knowledge that the press waits below, ready to turn thought into form. There is, too, the unspoken comfort of Leonard's watchfulness. He knows the fluctuations of her mind, senses the days when she's drifting toward the darker currents. His care is not expressed in grand gestures, but in the steady tending of daily life, preparing a meal, ensuring the fire is lit, suggesting a walk when the air in her study has grown too dense. She trusts him in a way that is not dependent on constant reassurance, but on the quiet fact of his constancy. The press grows slowly, taking on larger projects, publishing work that the traditional houses might overlook or mishandle. They bring out new voices, experiment with forms, follow their own tastes rather than the dictates of the market. For Virginia, this is a liberation as much as it is a responsibility, the ability to shape not only her own writing, but the physical life of the word she values. And yet, the old patterns remain. Even as the press flourishes and her marriage offers stability, her mind does not always move in step with the life around her. There are days when the sound of the press below seems impossibly distant, when even the simplest sentence refuses to arrange itself on the page. She retreats, then returns, the cycle as familiar now as the seasons. The work of the press offers a counterweight to these shifts. The mechanical nature of the labor, the setting of type, the steady pull of the lever, the stacking of finished sheets, grounds her in the physical world. It's a reminder that words are not only thoughts, but objects, that they exist in space and can be held, turned, read, and returned to. One evening, after a long day of printing, she stands in the doorway of the dining room, looking at the stacks of freshly bound volumes lined neatly along the table. The smell of ink hangs in the air, mingling with the faint scent of supper from the kitchen. Leonard is still at the press, his hands moving with the practiced ease of repetition. She watches him for a moment before stepping into the room, the floorboards creaking under her weight. The press thumps, the paper rustles, and the sound fills the small space like a heartbeat. She thinks of the ship in The Voyage Out, of the slow push of its engine in the dark, of the way both the ship and press carry their cargo forward without asking where it will be received. There's a comfort in that, this sense of motion, of work that continues regardless of the shifting weather of the mind. Outside, the evening deepens. The last light slips from the garden, leaving the windows as dark mirrors. Somewhere in the distance, a train passes, its low rumble briefly overtaking the sound of the press before fading again. She turns back to the table, lifts one of the new books, and runs her hand over the cover. The paper is still faintly warm. Her hand rests on the freshly printed book, the faint warmth of the paper seeping into her skin as though the pages themselves still carry the breath of the press. The ink scent lingers, sharp, mineral, almost metallic, and beneath it lies the subtler aroma of the paper, faintly woody, like the memory of a forest caught in the grain. She lets her palm settle there a moment longer, feeling the quiet solidity of the object, the way it contains not only words but hours of labor, gestures repeated until they became muscle memory. And then, almost without realizing it, her mind begins to wander elsewhere, away from this small room in Richmond, into the rhythm of another city entirely. It begins with footsteps, not her own, but those of a woman walking briskly through a morning square, the leaves above her glimmering with sunlight just broken through the clouds. Clarissa Dalloway comes into focus not as an invention, but as a presence, moving through London with a certain lightness, her thoughts weaving between the streets she walks and the decades behind her. The city seems to open before her like a book she's read many times and still finds new passages in. Virginia has been storing away fragments of London for years. The flower shops with their buckets of bloom spilling scent into the pavement air, the rumble of omnibuses crossing Westminster Bridge, the echo of Big Ben marking the hour in a voice that belongs to the whole city. These impressions have always been there, waiting, but now they begin to assemble themselves around Clarissa, her errands, her encounters, her mind moving fluidly between present and past. She writes in bursts, often after long walks through the streets. Sometimes she follows Clarissa's imagined path, past Bond Street's polished shop fronts, along the sweep of Piccadilly, through St. James's Park, where the trees lean over the water and the ducks drift in lazy circles. She notes the smell of roasting chestnuts near the street corner, the flicker of sunlight on a woman's silk dress as she steps from a carriage, the particular blue of the summer sky above the rooftops. Each detail is like a stitch in the tapestry she is slowly bringing into being. But Mrs. Dalloway is not only Clarissa's story. It is also the story of Septimus Warren Smith, whose mind has been fractured by the war, whose perception shifts between unbearable clarity and suffocating despair. Writing Septimus is both familiar and perilous for Virginia. Familiar because she knows the texture of such thought from within, perilous because the act of setting it down requires her to walk the edges of her own shadowed landscapes. There are days when Septimus's voice overtakes the work, when his visions burn more vividly than the bright shop windows or the park in summer light. On such days, she leaves the desk unsettled, as though she's been too long in a room without air. Leonard notices these shifts, his quiet watchfulness a kind of anchor, drawing her back into the ordinary motions of the day. Tea in the garden, a small task at the press, the grounding of hands on tangible work. Still, the book draws her forward. She feels in it the chance to capture something she has been circling for years, the sense that a single day can hold the entirety of a life's weight, that the present moment is never free of the layers of time that lie beneath it. She works not to strip those layers away, but to let them be visible, to show how the mind moves between them as naturally as a bird dips from air to water and back again. London itself becomes a character, its streets and squares not merely the setting, but the breath in which the story lives. She writes its soundscape, the distant chime of bells, the clip of hooves, the street hawker's call. She writes its light, the sudden blaze when clouds part, the muted silver of afternoon rain, the deepening gold as evening slides in. She writes its texture, the rough brick of a terrace wall, the smooth curve of a polished railing, the damp coolness of stone steps descending to the embankment. The work is not without difficulty. The structure she envisions, slipping in and out of different minds, carrying the reader not only through streets but through thought, defies the conventions that many still expect of the novel. She knows it will puzzle some, perhaps even alienate them. Yet the more she writes, the more she feels that there is no other way to tell this story, no other form that could contain its shifting currents without breaking them. When she finally sets down her pen on the last page, the manuscript before her feels at once complete and still alive, as though its characters might continue walking through the city long after she has stopped following them. The relief is not the relief of an ending, but of having set down something that has been pressing against the mind for too long, asking to be given form. The months that follow bring the familiar unease of waiting. The manuscript moves into other hands, and she begins to hear its echoes return in the form of proofs, queries, and later, reviews. Praise arrives, thoughtful and warm in some quarters. In others, confusion or indifference. She receives them all with the same measured detachment she has learned over the years, aware of their power to unsettle, yet unwilling to let them dictate the worth of the work itself. Walking through London after Mrs. Dalloway is published, she finds herself noticing the city differently. She watches the people she passes with a sense of kinship, as though each might be carrying a novel of their own in the space between their steps and their gaze. The day itself feels layered now, each moment shadowed by the lives that intersect with it unseen. One afternoon, she stops at a flower shop much like the one Clarissa visits in the book. Buckets of roses and sweet peas spill their scent into the air, and for a moment she stands very still, letting the color and perfume settle over her. It is as if she has stepped into her own sentence, the one she once wrote of Clarissa pausing before the flowers, feeling the day itself expand around her. That evening, she returns to Richmond by train, the windows reflecting the last flush of daylight over the fields. Leonard meets her at the station, and together they walk back through the quiet streets to their home. The press is silent tonight, the stacks of printed pages resting in neat order on the table. She sets down her bag, and for a moment her hand lingers there, on the edge of the table, feeling again the still warmth of a book newly born. From somewhere outside, faint but steady, comes the sound of footsteps passing along the road. She hears them recede into the distance, merging with the soft rustle of leaves stirred by the evening wind. The footsteps fade into the evening wind, their rhythm dissolving into the soft sifting of leaves along the quiet Richmond road. She stands listening for a moment longer, though there's nothing more to hear, only the slow deepening of the dark and the faint, steady ticking of the clock in the hall. And yet, in that stillness, another sound begins to rise within her. It is not the city's murmur now, but the long, deliberate pulse of waves folding over themselves on a shore far from here. The tide comes in and out without hurry, bringing with it the light of a place she has not seen for many years, but carries always in her mind, St. Ives, and the lighthouse that stands sentinel beyond the rocks. This memory does not arrive as a single image. It comes in fragments, as it always has. The white flash of the lighthouse beam sweeping over the darkened water, the salt, sweet wind lifting her hair, the way the morning sun would turn the windows of Talland House into bright, unblinking eyes. In the garden, the scent of fuchsias and sea thrift mingled with a sharper tang of salt from the bay. She remembers walking down to the shore as a child, her feet sinking into the sand still damp from the night tide, her gaze drawn to the thin, unwavering column of the lighthouse rising beyond the scattered rocks like something both utterly real and entirely imagined. Years have passed since she last stood on that beach, yet the place has been gathering in her like a tide that cannot be turned. Now, after Mrs. Dalloway, it begins to shape itself into a new form, not the St. Ives of memory alone, but a version altered by the slow sediment of time and loss. The Ramsay family begins to appear in her mind, their house by the sea, their days unfolding in the particular rhythm of holidays, the long, unstructured hours, the small rituals that hold their own gravity, the sense of waiting for something, good weather, a promised trip, a change that never quite comes when expected. She writes with a strange mixture of tenderness and precision, as though she's both standing inside the house and observing it from the far side of the years. The novel becomes, in part, a way of walking again through rooms long vanished, of hearing the murmur of voices she can never hear again, her mother's chief among them. Julia Stevens' presence runs through the book like a current beneath the surface, shaping Mrs. Ramsay's warmth, her beauty, her quiet authority. Writing her is both a return and a reckoning, a way of seeing her not through the unblinking eyes of a child, but through the shifting lens of memory, love, and loss. The work moves in three parts, each with its own tide. The first is the fullness of life in the house by the sea, the anticipation of the lighthouse visit, the web of small interactions that define a family's summer. The second is a compression of time itself, years passing in the space of a few pages, the house empty, the seasons erasing the traces of its inhabitants, even as the lighthouse stands unchanged. The third brings the return, the long-delayed trip across the bay, the arrival at a destination that has been waiting all along. She does not write this book in a single, unbroken stream. There are pauses, returns, days when the distance between the present and the past feels too vast to cross. At times, the act of writing Mrs. Ramsay threatens to draw her too far into the ache of absence. At others, it feels like a gift, as though she's been allowed one more summer in her mother's company. Leonard watches her closely during these months, offering the same quiet constancy that has anchored her through other works. But even he cannot always reach her when she is deep in the shifting weather of the Ramsay world. The lighthouse itself becomes more than a setting. It is a presence, an emblem of the way certain things in life remain fixed, while all else changes around them. In her mind, it is both the object of longing and the measure of time's passage, its beam sweeping across years as easily as it does across the surface of the sea. She writes it as she remembers it, sometimes near, sometimes impossibly far. Always both reachable and unreachable. London feels distant as she works, though she still walks its streets, still attends to the press and its demands. In her mind, however, she's on the Cornish coast, watching the light change from moment to moment, noting how the sea can shift from slate gray to pale green in the space of a breath. She fills her pages with the sound of the waves, the weight of still afternoons, the quiet press of evening when the air grows cool and the colors deepen toward blue. When To the Lighthouse is finished, she feels an unfamiliar mixture of exhaustion and release. It is not the release of having completed a task, but the release of having carried something long enough and finally set it down. The book is, in many ways, a farewell, not only to her mother, but to the particular shape of childhood summers, to the sense that time might be held in place if only one paid enough attention. Publication brings a warmth she has not always known. Critics respond with admiration. Readers write of feeling seen in ways they did not expect. Yet even in this reception, she feels the distance between what she has written and what it becomes once it leaves her hands. For her, the novel will always be less about what others read in it and more about the act of having written it, about the days she spent at her desk with the smell of salt in her imagination and the beam of the lighthouse sweeping through her mind's horizon. One evening, not long after the book appears, she walks along the Thames with Leonard. The river is wide and slow under the fading light, and for a moment the glint on its surface catches her in the same way the bay in St. Ives once did. She stops, looking out across the water toward the far bank, and for the briefest instant she sees, or thinks she sees, the white flicker of a lighthouse beam turning in the dusk. She knows it is only a trick of light, a reflection from some passing vessel, but she holds the image as they walk on. Later at home, she sits by the window, the house quiet around her. The night air moves gently through the open sash, carrying the distant smell of the river. She closes her eyes, and the sound of the waves returns. Not the Thames now, but the slow, unbroken tide of the Cornish shore. Somewhere out there, beyond the rocks, the lighthouse keeps turning, its beam cutting across the dark. The lighthouse beam turns once more across the dark, then fades into the blackness, leaving her with the afterimage, a pale arc suspended in the mind's eye, still moving though the night has swallowed it. She sits with that lingering light, and somewhere in its slow sweep, another image begins to gather. Not the steadfast tower rooted to one place, but a figure moving freely through centuries, unbound by the ordinary lines of time. It is less a thought than a sensation at first, a flicker of playfulness that stands in contrast to the measured gravity of To the Lighthouse. The figure becomes Orlando, and with him, or perhaps her or both at once, comes the idea of a life that resists all fixed definition, one that slips easily between identities. between ages, between the edges of what prose is expected to do. She's no stranger to the freedom of bending form, but Orlando offers her something else: permission to be unabashedly light while still holding depth, to move with the swiftness of a dream and the slyness of a private joke. At its heart lies Vita Sackville West, though not as the world knows her. Their friendship, intense, layered, threaded with admiration and desire, becomes the quiet axis around which Orlando's centuries turn. Vita's ancestral home, Knoll, with its sprawling rooms and shifting history, becomes the physical counterpart to Orlando's journey, a house that holds not just objects but the sediment of entire lives. Writing this book feels different from the start. There is none of the painstaking excavation of memory that marked To the Lighthouse, none of the cautious balancing between light and shadow. Instead, there is a sense of speed, of language moving ahead almost faster than her hand can follow. She lets herself indulge in flourishes, in sudden leaps from one century to another, in playful asides that break the frame of the narrative. It is a kind of liberation, as if the very act of writing has loosened the knots that held her to a more solemn pace. And yet, beneath the play, there is structure, a careful thread that binds the transformations together. Orlando may change in form and in gender, but there is always continuity in the voice, in the way the world is observed and felt. The experiment, she realizes, is not only in telling the story, but in testing the elasticity of language itself, how far it can stretch without breaking, how many shapes it can take before it no longer recognizes itself. Vita moves through the work like a shadow made of light. Their correspondence is constant, letters passing between Richmond and Longbarn, then Sissinghurst, each carrying both the warmth of daily life and the sharper spark of shared imagination. Vita reads the early pages and understands what Virginia is doing without needing it explained. Her own presence in the book is at once literal and transformed, a living person turned into a mythic figure who can cross centuries and emerge unchanged. The Hogarth Press becomes the natural home for Orlando. Leonard watches the manuscript grow with a mixture of bemusement and admiration, aware that it is unlike anything they have yet published. When the proofs are set and the pages pass through the press, Virginia lingers over them, noting the way the ink holds the curving lines of her sentences, the way the printed words carry both the swiftness of their creation and the precision of their final form. When the book appears in 1928, it is received with an energy she has rarely felt before. Readers are charmed, intrigued, unsettled by its refusal to obey the usual boundaries. Critics speak of it as biography, as fantasy, as satire. It is, in truth, all of these and none. Vita receives it with the knowing smile of someone who has been both muse and co-conspirator. For Virginia, the reception is almost secondary to the pleasure of having written it, of having let language run to the very edge of its usual territory and leap beyond. The months after Orlando are colored by this new sense of possibility. She finds herself thinking differently about form, not in terms of what it can hold, but in terms of what it can become when freed from the expectation of strict realism. She walks through London with the same attentive eye as before, but now even the most ordinary details seem to shimmer, with the potential to slip sideways into something stranger. A passing face that might belong equally to the 16th century as to the present. A street that could, with the turn of a sentence, become the antechamber to some other world. Her connection with Vita deepens in this period, though it moves as all human relationships do, through moments of closeness and of distance, through shared work and private silences. The exchange of letters continues, their words carrying both the intimacy of confidences and the theatricality of two writers who understand the pleasure of performance. In Vita, she recognizes a kindred spirit in the refusal to be contained, a defiance of the rigid shapes life might otherwise impose. Yet the lightness of Orlando does not mean the absence of shadow. She is aware, even in the exhilaration of its reception, that such playfulness cannot be the only mode in which she works. The cycles of her mind still turn, the darker tides still return, sometimes without warning, breaking the surface of even the brightest days. Leonard remains vigilant, though he never makes his vigilance a cage. The press continues, the steady work of ink and type grounding them both in the material world. Still, Orlando has given her a kind of gift, proof that she can write from joy as well as from grief. That invention can be as sustaining as excavation. It opens a door she had not realized was closed, and through it she can see the possibility of future works shaped not only by memory, but by the boundless, shifting potential of the imagination. One evening, months after the book's release, she visits Vita at Sissinghurst. They walk through the gardens in the fading light, the air rich with the scent of roses, the walls of the old tower catching the last glow of the sun. From the top, the view spreads out in all directions: fields, hedgerows, a slow-moving ribbon of water in the distance. It is a view that could belong to any century, and for a moment she feels as though she has stepped into Orlando's world, where time folds in on itself and the present holds all its past at once. When she returns to Richmond that night, the air along the Thames is cool and faintly misted. The lamps reflect in the dark water, doubling their number, and she stands for a moment on the bridge, watching the ripples break and reform. Somewhere in the distance, a train passes with a low, steady rumble, and the sound reminds her of the press, its ceaseless motion, its measured turning. She thinks of the pages it will print in the years to come, of the sentences not yet written, of the edges of language she has not yet reached. She turns from the water and begins to walk home, the faint scent of roses still clinging to her sleeve. She walks home along the quiet Richmond streets, the scent of roses lingering faintly on her sleeve, their sweetness edged with the cool damp of the night air. The lamps throw pale halos on the pavement, and her footsteps pass in and out of shadow, the rhythm steady, unhurried. The day has left her with a clear sense of purpose, though it is not tied to any single book. It is instead a slow-forming conviction, one that has been building for years, gathering weight with each page she has written, each conversation overheard, each silence endured in rooms where women's voices were meant only to listen, not to speak. By the time she reaches her own door, the conviction has taken on a shape. It is not simply about her own life, but about the long pattern into which it fits, a pattern that has kept women from the means to create freely, that has kept their words unspoken or unwritten. She knows she cannot address this only in the privacy of her own thoughts. It must be said aloud, even if saying it will mean stepping into a light she does not always welcome. The occasion comes in 1928, when she's invited to speak at the women's colleges of Cambridge, Newnham and Girton. The request is straightforward enough, a lecture on women and fiction. But from the moment she begins to think about it, she knows it will not be a polite recitation of literary history. She begins instead with a simple, almost tangible premise that a woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. The clarity of it surprises her. It is not metaphor alone. It is a statement of physical fact, drawn from her own years of writing in borrowed spaces, of working between interruptions, of navigating the invisible walls built around women's lives. She travels to Cambridge with notes that are more fragments than formal script. Observations, questions, examples. The rest she will find in the act of speaking, in the way her thoughts move as she walks the long path from the gates to the hall, passing the lawns trimmed to the inch, the cloisters that seem to belong to another age. When she stands before the room, her voice carries not with oratory, but with the kind of steady intimacy that makes the listener feel they are part of a private conversation. She speaks of Shakespeare's sister, a figure she invents to reveal the weight of history's exclusions. This imagined woman, gifted with the same genius as her brother, is denied education, denied freedom, and driven into silence. She speaks of the centuries in which women wrote in secret, or not at all, their work left unsigned or lost entirely. She speaks too of the small liberties now gained, though they are fragile and incomplete. The lecture is neither a plea nor an accusation, but a mapping of the distance between what is and what might be. When the words are later expanded into the essay, A Room of One's Own, the form itself mirrors the mind's movement, drifting from observation to reflection, from the streets of London to the shelves of the library, from the material fact of a locked door to the imagined life of an unwritten book. It's not a treatise, it is a walk through thought, one that invites the reader to follow her as she turns corners, pauses to look in a window, crosses into another street of ideas. The reception is immediate and varied. Some praise its clarity, its quiet insistence. Others bristle at its implications, dismissing the call for space and means as self-indulgence. But she knows it will live beyond the span of reviews. It has the shape of something that will be returned to, perhaps in decades yet to come. when the questions it asks will still be waiting to be answered. In her own life, the essay is more than a public argument, it is a private affirmation. The room she speaks of is not only the physical space in which to work, but the mental one, the unbroken stretch of thought in which a sentence can grow without being trampled by interruption. She sees now how her years in shared houses, her early writing at small tables in the corners of bedrooms, taught her to work in fragments, to fit thought into whatever gaps were left. And she sees, too, how different it is to work in a space claimed without apology. The door closed not as a barrier, but as a boundary that makes the work inside possible. Her walks in London take on a new texture during this time. She finds herself noticing the women who move through the streets alone, wondering whether they have rooms to return to, whether they have the means to choose their own hours. She sees them in tea rooms, in libraries, in the small corners of parks where they sit with books or sketch pads. Each one seems part of an unspoken map, a network of solitary presences moving quietly through the city, each holding her own thoughts as she goes. At the Hogarth Press, the essay moves through the familiar process, type set in neat lines, proofs corrected, sheets pressed and bound. But this time, she feels the weight of the subject in a different way. It is not only her own voice being printed, but the echo of those who have been silent. When she holds the finished book in her hands, the cover cool and smooth beneath her fingers, she thinks of all the rooms in which it might be read, the cramped student quarters lit by a single lamp, the quiet studies lined with books, the shared spaces where a reader might hide it under a cushion when someone enters. The months that follow are filled with other work, reviews, drafts, correspondence, but a room of one's own lingers at the edge of her mind. It has shifted something, not only in how she writes, but in how she sees herself within the long arc of women's voices in literature. She feels less like a solitary figure now, and more like one point in a chain, connected to both the unnamed women who came before and those who will come after. One evening, returning from the press, she stops at a small cafe near the Strand. The tables are crowded with students and clerks, their talk rising and falling in uneven waves. At the table beside her, two young women are bent over a book, their heads close together. She cannot hear their words, but the sight of them, intent, animated, oblivious to the rest of the room, brings a faint private smile to her face. She leaves without disturbing them, stepping back into the street where the lamplight pools in the rain-slick gutters. The Thames is only a few streets away, and she walks toward it, the city's sound softening with each step. When she reaches the embankment, the river lies dark and wide, the lamps along its edge doubling themselves in the ripples. She leans on the rail, feeling the cool metal beneath her hands, and thinks again of the simple truth she had spoken at Cambridge: money and a room of one's own. The words are still as plain and solid as the river's slow current, still carrying their weight beneath the surface. Somewhere far off, a clock strikes the hour, its chime carrying faintly over the water. She turns toward home, her footsteps falling into the measured rhythm of the sound. Her footsteps follow the chime's fading echo along the riverbank, the sound of the water moving in the dark blending with the steady rhythm of her stride. The air is cool, almost still, and the lamps reflect themselves in the Thames as if the city has hung a second sky beneath its bridges. She walks without hurry, letting the night shape itself around her, aware of the way its quiet changes the pace of thought. The river will look different in the morning light, just as a sentence that feels certain in the lamplight may seem uncertain in the day's clear air. This movement between night and day has always been part of her work. She senses that the two halves of the cycle feed different kinds of writing. The day with its clarity, its ordered light, its attention sharpened by routine. The night with its loosened edges, its dissolving of boundaries, its permission to drift between memory and invention. She writes in both, though never in the same way. Morning pages are measured, deliberate. Night pages slip more easily into the currents of the mind, bringing with them thoughts she might not have reached by daylight. The seasons, too, have their influence. Winter sharpens her concentration. Mornings cold enough that the first task is to light the fire, fingers stiff on the pen until the room warms. In those months, she tends toward precision, chiseling at sentences until they hold the exact shape she has in mind. Spring, by contrast, draws her outward, the lengthening light making her restless, more likely to walk before she writes, to let the day's impressions spill onto the page while they are still fresh. Summer is a time of expansion. Sentences that stretch longer, thoughts that take the scenic route toward their conclusion. Autumn brings a kind of melancholy clarity, the turning leaves reminding her of the work left unfinished before the year closes. Her diaries hold traces of these shifts, though they are never recorded as a pattern. Instead, the changes appear as passing remarks, a note on the light at her desk, a line about the sound of rain on the roof, a brief mention of how easily, or how stubbornly, the words have come that day. The entries are not planned so much as markers, small signposts left for a future reader who might see the shape of the road more clearly than she does in the walking of it. Leonard moves through these cycles with her, attuned to the subtle changes in her energy. He knows the signs of a morning that will be spent at the desk without interruption, just as he knows the signs of a day when the work will not hold, and she will need to be coaxed into the open air. Sometimes this means a walk by the river. Sometimes it means an afternoon tending to the press, the tangible labor of ink and paper offering a counterweight to the abstraction of thought. There are stretches of days when her energy is high, her mind bright with the quick connections that leap from one idea to the next. In those times, the work seems to assemble itself almost without resistance, each page carrying the momentum of the last. But there are also the slower days, when the mind feels thick, when even the smallest decision, where to begin a sentence, how to place a word, seems to require more effort than it should. She has learned not to treat these days as failure. They are part of the larger rhythm, as necessary as the nights between days, as the winters between springs. Her walks in Richmond and London often fall into a pattern that mirrors this alternation. In the morning, she takes the more direct routes, her steps purposeful, her gaze attentive to detail. By evening, she prefers the longer way home, the streets that curve without hurry, the parks where the air cools more quickly than on the roads, the places where the sound of the city is softened by trees. She has found that it is often on these less direct paths that ideas rise unbidden, slipping into her mind with the ease of something that was always there, simply waiting for her to notice. The Hogarth Press continues its steady work through these cycles. Manuscripts arrive in brown paper parcels, proofs are read, type is set, pages printed. The seasons make themselves felt even here. In winter, the ink takes longer to dry. In summer, the scent of it seems to fill the entire house. She likes the contrast between the press's constancy and the changing weather of her own mind, one moving forward at its own pace regardless of mood, the other swayed by the subtle turns of light and time. Evenings often bring a return to the desk, though the work is different from the mornings. The lamplight closes the space around her, making the page the brightest thing in the room. The outside world fades to a murmur, the occasional cart on the road, the rustle of wind against the glass. In that narrowed focus, she can follow a thought more deeply, less distracted by the claims of the day. It is not uncommon for her to lose track of the hour, the only measure of time being the gradual tilt of her handwriting as the night goes on. She knows that these cycles, of light and dark, of high and low, are not entirely within her control. The darker periods come without invitation, as they always have, settling over her with a weight that makes even the simplest act feel distant. In those times, the difference between night and day blurs, the hours losing their edges. Yet, even then, she keeps the habit of sitting at her desk, if only to hold a pen in her hand, to keep open the possibility that the words might return. When they do return, it is often suddenly, as if they had been gathering somewhere just out of reach. The page fills quickly then, the sentences carrying with them the energy of release. She has learned to work without clinging too tightly to either state, to welcome the full days without expecting them always, to endure the thin ones without believing they will last forever. One autumn evening, as the air begins to cool and the leaves along the river turn to ochre and copper, she walks home under a sky that holds the first hints of winter. The lamps have been lit earlier than the week before, their light catching in the water as the wind ruffles its surface. She pauses on the bridge, watching the ripples distort each reflection until they resemble lines of handwriting loosened by the movement of the current. The thought comes to her, unforced, that the work too is like this, sometimes clear, sometimes altered by the currents beneath it, always part of a larger flow that cannot be hurried. She turns from the river and continues toward home, her steps slow, the night air cool against her face. Through the quiet streets, the first lights of evening gleam in windows, some already drawn with curtains, others open to the dusk. In one, she glimpses a figure bent over a table, head bowed to the page. The The sight is gone in an instant, but it stays with her as she reaches her own door, where her desk waits in the lamplight, the day's last shadows falling across the blank sheet of paper. The lamplight falls across the blank sheet, pale and steady, as if waiting for her to speak into its circle. Beyond the desk, the rest of the room is dim, its edges softened into shadow, and beyond that lies the night, the dark pressed close against the glass. She sits with her pen poised, but no single sentence forms. Instead, there's a sound in her mind, soft, unbroken, rising and falling with the patience of something that has been there far longer than she has noticed. It is the sea, but not as it exists in one place or one time. It is the sea as she has always carried it, layered with all its weathers, all its voices, all its hours. This is how The Waves begins, not with a plot or a character, but with a rhythm, a motion that belongs as much to language as it does to water. She can almost see the surface in her mind, the first glimmer of light touching it at dawn, the shadows moving beneath, the constant shift that never repeats itself in quite the same way. Into this movement come voices, not speaking to one another, but alongside each other, each tracing its own course through the same tide. Bernard, Susan, Rhoda, Neville, Ginny, Louis. Their names arrive like buoys marking different channels, yet all are drawn by the same current. Writing this book feels unlike any work she has done before. It is not the building of rooms and streets, nor the shaping of events into sequence. It is something closer to music, where meaning is carried not only by what is said, but by the intervals between, by the repetition of a phrase in a new key, by the way one voice can echo another without answering it directly. She moves between their soliloquies and the sea interludes, the light shifting across the water as the hours of the day, and the decades of life pass in parallel. There are days when she feels almost entirely absorbed by the experiment, her own sense of time bending to match the book's. Morning slips into evening without the usual markers, the work unfolding in the long, unbroken stretches, her pen moving as though it already knows the path. At other times, the sheer abstraction of it threatens to loosen her hold. The absence of a traditional structure, the refusal of the book to anchor itself in the familiar shapes of narrative, leaves her at the mercy of its rhythm. She must trust it, though it leads her into waters where there is no visible shore. The sea passages, those brief, recurring visions of waves, light, and sky, become the book's heartbeat. They are not descriptions of a single place, but a distillation of every coast she has known. The blue-gray expanse of Cornwall, the muddy pull of the Thames, the distant glitter she has seen from a train window. The sea is always itself, and never the same, and she writes it so that it can hold the passing of years without speaking of them directly. In the voices of the 6 characters, she allows herself to explore different facets of the self, fragments that might once have been kept apart, but here are allowed to stand side by side. Bernard's search for the perfect phrase, Susan's rootedness in the land, Rhoda's flight from solidity, Neville's hunger for beauty, Ginny's bright physicality, Louis's sense of being always just outside the center. They are all parts of a whole, moving in and out of each other's company, yet never merging entirely. The work is demanding in a way that is not physical, but almost bodily in its intensity. By the time she lays down her pen each day, she feels as though she has been swimming for hours, her mind and body both attuned to the pull and release of an unseen tide. Leonard notices her absorption and the toll it takes. He brings her tea without disturbing her, adjusts the lamp when the light has shifted without her noticing, quietly steers the small routines of the house so that she can remain in the flow of the work. Outside her study, the Hogarth press continues its steady pulse, the turning of the press like a metronome to her own irregular music. Manuscripts are printed, bound, sent out into the world. Visitors come and go, their conversations briefly pulling her from the sea and the voices that inhabit it. Sometimes these interruptions are welcome, a reminder of the land beneath her feet. Other times she feels the tug back toward the desk even as she listens. When The Waves is finished, she is both relieved and uncertain. The book does not resemble the works that have come before it. It has no anchor in a single plot, no fixed point of view, no attempt to disguise the passage of life as a sequence of events. It is instead a pattern of recurring light and shadow, of voices rising and falling like the swell of the sea. She knows it will puzzle some readers, perhaps even alienate them, but she also knows that it is the truest form the work could have taken. The months after its publication in 1931 bring both admiration and incomprehension. Some critics call it a masterpiece. Others find it impenetrable. She listens to these judgments without bending to them, aware that the book's nature makes such divisions inevitable. For her, the measure of its success is not in the reviews, but in the fact that it exists at all, that she has followed the rhythm to its end, without letting it break apart in her hands. In the quiet after the waves, she feels a peculiar emptiness, as though the tide has gone out and left her standing on a wide stretch of shore. She walks more in these weeks, following the river paths in Richmond, letting the steady movement of her feet replace the now absent pull of the book's current. The sea remains in her, though, its sound in the back of her mind, its light shifting just beyond sight. One evening, she returns from such a walk as the last of the daylight fades. In the study, her desk waits, the blank page again the brightest thing in the room. She sits, listening for a moment to the distant sounds of the house, the faint clink of a cup in the kitchen, the low murmur of Leonard's voice speaking to someone at the door. Then she bends over the paper, not yet to write, but to let her pen rest there, touching the surface lightly, as if it were the skin of still water. From outside, the wind stirs, and in its movement she hears a faint echo of the sea's unbroken motion. She closes her eyes, and the image returns, not of a single wave, but of the whole restless expanse, moving in all directions at once, without beginning or end. The pen's tip rests lightly against the paper, like a fingertip on still water, yet no ripple forms. She lifts it at last and sets it down beside the inkwell, feeling the faint ache in her hand from the long months with the waves. The room holds its own kind of pause, a suspension between one work and whatever might follow, the air thick with both possibility and reluctance. It is in such spaces, between the end of one tide and the arrival of another, that ideas sometimes begin to collect like silt at the river's edge. Outside, the world has grown heavier. The 1930s move on with the sound of boots in distant streets, with the headlines that grow starker by the month, with the rising sense that the air is tightening around Europe. Yet within her own rooms, there is still the ordinary rhythm of the press, the visits from friends, the walks along the river where the light falls across the water as it always has. She begins to imagine a book that will hold both these worlds, the private and the public, the timeless and the immediate, without forcing them into opposition. It begins with a village, not a village from her own life exactly, though it carries shades of places she's known, its hedges thick with summer, its cottages strung along a single street, its fields stretching out toward a low, hazy horizon. The village is preparing for a pageant, a yearly play staged on the green, where the locals take on roles from history with varying degrees of conviction. The pageant will be the frame, but what happens within it, between its acts, will be the book's true center. She calls it Between the Acts, and from the first pages it carries the lightness and quickness of something seen through shifting air. The scenes move between the preparations for the play and the conversations of those who have gathered to watch, weaving in and out of private thoughts, passing glances, half-formed reflections. It is as though the day itself is the play, the pageant on the green only its mirror. The language feels different from the waves, less like the unbroken motion of the sea, and more like sunlight catching on the surface of a moving river. Momentary flashes, each distinct, each gone before it can be fully held. She works to capture the way attention drifts during such events, the mind half on the performance, half on a memory, a plan, a stray image that arrives without warning. The shifts are subtle, and she takes care to let them happen without signaling them, trusting the reader to follow as the day unfolds. The pageant itself moves through the ages, Elizabethan, Restoration, Victorian, each scene a distillation rather than a reenactment, the kind of history one might carry in a handful of remembered phrases and gestures. It is playful, yet there is a persistent undercurrent, the awareness that another war is looming, that the world beyond the village green is already in motion toward something that will sweep this peaceful day into the past. In the spaces between the performances, the characters speak of small things, tea, the weather, an absent neighbor, but the larger currents are felt in their silences, in the glances that pass between them. She's interested in this in-between, the way life happens not only in the grand events but in the pauses that surround them. It is here, she feels, that the truth of a moment resides, not in the act itself, but in the breath before and after. The work progresses slowly. The growing tensions in the world press in on her. The headlines cannot be shut out entirely, nor the sound of planes overhead during air raid drills, nor the rationing that has begun to change the shape of daily life. Yet she returns to the village, to the play on the green, as if it offers a way of holding still what is otherwise slipping too quickly toward destruction. Writing becomes a kind of preservation, even as she knows that the preservation is temporary, as all such things are. Leonard reads the pages as they come. His response is quiet but attentive. He sees in the book a return to some of her earlier clarity, but also a sharpening, an awareness of fragility that runs beneath the surface like an underground stream. She does not tell him how difficult it is some days to sit at the desk while the wireless hums with news of another border crossed, another city bombed. Instead, she writes as if the page itself is the last open space in which the mind can move freely. By the time she finishes the draft, the war has begun in earnest. The summer of the pageant feels, even in her own mind, like something already lost. She reads through the manuscript and finds that its quietness is not the quiet of peace, but the quiet before a storm. There is beauty in it still, but also an ache, a sense that the day on the green will never be repeated in quite the same way. The book is, in many ways, her most fragile. It does not demand attention with grand declarations. It does not shout. It moves instead in quick, precise touches, each carrying more than it says outright. She feels protective of it, aware that its subtleties may be overlooked, but unwilling to alter its shape for the sake of clarity. It is, she knows, exactly the form it is meant to be. One evening, after she has set the final pages aside, she steps out into the garden. The air is cool, the light already fading, and the first bats are flickering through the dusk. She stands for a while, listening to the layered quiet, the faint rustle of leaves, the distant rumble of a train, the muted thump of the press inside. The garden smells of earth and something faintly sweet, late roses perhaps, or the last of the summer flowers. She thinks of the pageant in the book, of the moment when the players leave the stage and the audience shifts in their seats, waiting for the next act. It is in that moment, the pause, the uncertainty, the slight movement toward what comes next, that she feels herself standing now, between acts, with no clear script for what will follow. The light fades further, and she turns back toward the house. Through the open window, she can see the desk, the lamp already lit, the surface clear except for a single sheet of paper. The pen lies across it, as if waiting for the next line to begin. The pen lies across the paper as if it has been set there only for a moment, yet the moment stretches. She doesn't pick it up. Outside, the air has thickened, the night no longer just a darkness, but a space filled with distant movement, a faint, continuous hum that does not belong to the wind. The war, once held at the edges of her hearing, has begun to press closer. It no longer arrives only through the wireless or the headlines. It is in the sky, in the sudden silences that fall over the street, in the way light is dimmed behind blackout curtains. The Blitz comes to London with its own rhythm, a grim punctuation of sirens and silence, of waiting and impact. Even in Richmond, the night air can carry the tremor of bombs dropped miles away. On some mornings, she walks through streets where the air still smells of smoke and brick dust, where windows gape open to nothing, where a single chair or teacup stands intact among rubble, as if left for her to read like a strange punctuation mark in the day. Her own house in London does not escape. One afternoon, the news reaches them. Talland House in Gordon Square, the rooms that once held the gatherings of friends, the sound of conversation, the slow warmth of evening, is gone. The destruction is not total, but it is enough. The walls gaping, the familiar spaces broken open to the sky. She doesn't see it at once, but the image forms anyway, and it feels like a private amputation. Leonard, practical and measured, speaks of salvaging what they can. She hears only the hollow sound of the wind moving where the ceiling once was. Life narrows. Journeys into the city are made only when necessary. Even in Richmond, the sense of siege is present. The ration books on the kitchen table, the taped windows, the occasional sharp instruction from a warden on the street. The air carries the smell of coal smoke more heavily now. as if the chimneys burn with the same guarded urgency as the searchlights that scan the night. The press continues, though its work is altered by the war. Paper is harder to come by, deliveries are delayed, and the press itself works under the threat of interruption. Still, they print books, pamphlets, works that remind her there is still a place for the written word, even as buildings fall. Setting type, inking the rollers, folding pages. The work is almost medicinal, grounding her in a rhythm that doesn't answer to the chaos outside. Yet the war seeps in all the same. Sometimes the drone of planes overhead stills her hand mid-sentence. Sometimes the siren interrupts the press entirely, the ink drying on the rollers as they leave the room for the shelter. The shelter air smells of damp concrete and the faint tang of tin. Voices hushed but edged with the awareness that the walls above may not hold. She sits there with others, neighbors, strangers, listening for the dull thud that might mean destruction, or the long, slow, all clear that means only a pause. In the narrow spaces left between raids, she still writes. The act feels different now, less like shaping a world from imagination, more like holding a flame against the wind. The sentences are shorter, the images sharper, as if they must be made strong enough to survive an interruption at any moment. She writes in daylight when she can, but the blackout has its own kind of concentration. The lamp's small circle of light, the rest of the room swallowed into shadow. Leonard watches her more closely during these months. He has always been her anchor, but now his steadiness has the quality of quiet defense, organizing, preparing, anticipating the moments when she might falter. He tends to the practicalities, food, fuel, the maintenance of routines that feel, in their persistence, like an act of resistance. Still, he cannot keep the war entirely from her mind, nor from her dreams, which are threaded now with images of falling walls, of open skies where ceilings should be. The garden remains, altered by the seasons but untouched by bombs, and it becomes a small refuge. Even in winter, there is the structure of bare branches against the sky, the occasional call of a bird. In spring, the flowers push up as they always have, their persistence both comforting and strange in the face of the city's destruction. She walks there in the mornings, letting the air clear her head before sitting to work. The garden smells of damp earth, of grass cut short, of the faint sweetness of whatever is in bloom, and for a moment it's possible to believe in the endurance of small things. Yet the world beyond the hedge is never silent. The war's voice carries on the wind, the rumble of lorries, the uneven thump of boots on the pavement, the high whine of planes passing unseen through cloud. Even in moments of stillness, there is the knowledge that it can all shift in an instant, that the line between ordinary life and its undoing has grown thin and frayed. On one such day, as she walks back from the garden to the house, she notices a faint vibration in the ground, so slight she might have missed it if she had been speaking. A moment later comes the muffled report of an explosion, far enough away that the air between seems to swallow some of its force. She stops, standing very still, feeling the way the sound seems to reach her in two waves, first through the earth, then through the air. When she moves again, it is with the awareness that the war has touched her day without breaking it, but that this balance is not guaranteed. At her desk that evening, she writes a line and leaves it unfinished. The pen rests in the ink for a moment longer than it should, as if reluctant to begin again. Somewhere outside, a siren rises, and she closes the notebook without haste, placing the pen neatly beside it. She moves through the house, switching off the light, the blackout curtain already drawn. In the dark, she hears the first drone of the planes, low and heavy, moving above the unseen city. The sound is both distant and immediate, as if it belongs to the air itself. She sits by the window for a moment, looking out into the absolute black, her own reflection faint in the glass. The night holds its breath, waiting for the first strike. The night holds its breath, and she with it. The window pane is cool beneath her fingertips, the glass faintly trembling with the low passage of engines overhead. She watches the blackness as if it might yield some shape, some flicker of light, but it gives nothing, only the steady drone, then the silence between. When she moves away, it is not toward the shelter, but toward her desk, guided more by instinct than intention. The blackout curtain keeps the room dim. She lights only the small lamp, its glow contained in a narrow circle on the table. The pen lies where she left it, beside the closed notebook, but tonight she does not open it. Instead, she draws a sheet of paper from the drawer, smooth and pale, the kind she keeps for letters. Her hand hesitates at the salutation. There's no shortage of names she might write. Leonard, Vanessa, Vita, friends scattered by the war. And yet the one that forms first is not a name for posting, but one she writes when the letter is not meant to travel, when the act is less about sending than about holding the voice of the other close in her own. She begins without date or address, the words moving in a slow arc across the page. They are not urgent, not about the war's immediate noise or the day's small events. Instead, she writes in the way one might speak beside a fire at night, in that low, drifting tone that slips between memory and thought. She writes of the morning light over the river, of the fox she glimpsed near the garden, of a sentence that had come to her while boiling water for tea. The details are ordinary, but they hold a weight she can't quite name. The weight of being seen, even if only by the imagined reader. Her letters, especially the ones she will not send, are not tidy narratives. They loop back, double on themselves, pause in the middle of a line as if listening for an answer that will never arrive. Sometimes she tears them up before she's finished. Sometimes she folds them into envelopes and leaves them in a drawer. They are not drafts of anything else. They are the act itself. Perhaps they are a way of speaking to the part of herself that does not find its way into fiction, the voice that is more tentative, more exposed. She has always written letters in this way, half diary, half conversation. But the war has sharpened their intimacy. The knowledge that a letter might never reach its destination, or that the person it is meant for might not be there to receive it, changes the act. Each line becomes both more fragile and more necessary. The words she does send to Leonard when apart, or to Vanessa in the country, carry the weight of the days between, of the uncertainty that they will not be read until the moment they are already part of the past. The unsent letters are different. They are not bounded by the need to explain or update. They are places where she can allow the mind to move without aim, where the image of a tree in the garden can turn into a memory of childhood, then into a sentence she has not yet written for any book. They are a conversation without interruption, without the tug of the other voice back toward the shared ground of spoken talk. Tonight's letter grows slowly. She writes of the pageant in between the acts, of how it has stayed with her even now, in the months since she laid down the last page. She writes of the silences between acts in life, of how they can feel both too short and impossibly long. She writes, without naming it, of the unease that has been threading through her days more tightly, of the sense that the mind's own defenses have been worn thin. She does not say this directly, she rarely does, but it is there in the turns of her sentences, in the way she lets them trail into the blank space at the margin. The siren's all clear comes while she's still writing, its long descending note almost mournful in the quiet. She doesn't stop. The pen moves until the last line curls to its close, until the sheet is filled and there is nothing more to add. She sets it aside without folding it, letting the ink dry in its own time. Tomorrow, perhaps, she will tear it up, or she will place it in the drawer with the others, its addressee unnamed, its journey ended before it began. The drawer itself has become a kind of archive, though she does not think of it in those terms. It holds letters from decades past, alongside those never sent, their envelopes unmarked, their paper carrying the faint scent of the room, ink, dust, a trace of lavender from the sachet she keeps nearby. Sometimes she reads through them, not in order, but as one might open a box of photographs, letting the past rise in whatever sequence it chooses. The letters do not explain her life. They refract it, scattering it into moments that exist without the need for resolution. It is late now, the lamp's light beginning to dull with the fatigue of its wick. She sets down her pen and closes the drawer, the faint click of the wood sounding loud in the stillness. Outside, the night has resumed its ordinary quiet, the plains gone, the sky unbroken, except for the low glow of the city's shielded lights. She stands by the window for a moment, looking out into the dark, the glass cold against her hand. Somewhere beyond sight, the river moves with the same steady current it has always had, indifferent to war or peace, to letters sent or unsent. She imagines dropping one of her folded pages into that water, watching it darken and sink, its words dissolving into the tide. Perhaps that is what they are for, not to be read, but to be carried away, broken down into something that belongs only to the moment of their writing. She draws the curtain closed and turns from the window. The desk is bare now, except for the lamp. The surface waiting for tomorrow's work. The war will still be there when the morning comes. The rationing, the sirens, the lists of the dead. But so will the paper, the ink, the room in which she can sit and shape a sentence. The pen lies where she left it, the point turned toward the center of the desk, as if it, too, is waiting. The pen lies waiting, its slender shadow stretching across the desk in the early light. Morning comes quietly in March, with a pale sun filtering through the drawn curtains, a sun that seems to promise nothing in particular. She moves about the room without hurry, her hands light on the small familiar objects, the teacup placed just so on its saucer, the spine of a book straightened on the shelf, a paper pushed to align with the desk's edge. These gestures have no urgency, yet they feel like a way of settling the air, of leaving things in order for an absence that need not be announced. The war is still there, pressing in from every side. The radio's voice has grown more relentless, the news no longer in bursts but in a steady stream. Yet this morning's quiet is of another kind. It does not belong to the war alone. It belongs to her, to a decision that has been gathering its weight over weeks, perhaps longer. She has thought of it in fragments, as one thinks of a place to which the road is already known. There has been no sudden moment of resolution, only the slow recognition that the balance has tipped, and that the mind she has lived within, sometimes at peace, sometimes aflame, no longer offers her ground that feels solid underfoot. Leonard moves in another part of the house. She hears him briefly, footsteps in the kitchen, the faint rattle of crockery, and imagines him turning to the work that must always be done, tending the garden, seeing to the press, making certain the day has its shape. There is tenderness in the thought of him, but it comes with the knowledge that tenderness alone cannot steady her now. She has tried to tell him in ways that might be heard without too much pain. She will try once more, on paper. She sits at the desk, the pen in her hand again, and begins to write. The letter is not long. It says what must be said, without ornament, without the circling of a thought that cannot be made less sharp by repetition. She tells him that she cannot go on, that the voices in her head have returned and will not be stilled, that she feels herself slipping beyond reach. She thanks him for his love, for the years in which they have made a life together, for the care that has been constant even when her mind was not. The words come with a kind of clarity, as if they have been waiting in order for her to simply copy them down. When it's done, she folds the paper carefully and places it where he will find it. The pen rests again beside the ink pot. She stands, letting her gaze move once more over the room. The books, the small vase on the mantel, the chair angled toward the fire. Each thing holds its place as if waiting for her return, though she knows she will not return. Her coat hangs in the hall, its deep pockets lined with the small stones she has gathered over the past days, not from any single place, but from walks along the riverbank, from the edges of the garden, from a quiet corner of the lane where the gravel lies loose, each one chosen for its smoothness, its weight in the hand. She slips them into her coat now, one by one, feeling the way they tug the fabric downward. There's no ceremony to it, only the sure knowledge that their weight will be enough. She steps outside. The air is cool, faintly damp, carrying the smell of the river even before she sees it. The path curves away from the house, bordered by hedges just beginning to show the first signs of spring. The sky is pale, its light diffused, the kind of day that might, in another year, have been marked for planting or for walking into the village for tea. But this morning, the path is hers alone. As she walks, the earth beneath her shoes feels soft from the recent rains. A bird calls once from somewhere high in the hedgerow, then is silent. The sound of the river grows clearer, its low, unbroken rush ahead of her. She keeps her pace steady, neither hurrying nor slowing. The stones in her pockets swing faintly with each step, a muted reminder of their presence. She reaches the bank. The water is higher than it was in winter, the current moving with a quiet insistence toward some distance she cannot see. Willow branches trail into the stream, their tips swaying with the flow. She stands there for a moment, feeling the ground under her feet, the cool air moving against her face. In her mind, there is no dramatic flourish, no final speech, only the simplicity of the act and the knowledge that it will be done. She steps forward until the water laps at her shoes, then her ankles, the cold climbing quickly. The current presses lightly at her legs, as if testing her resolve, and then she steps deeper, the stones pulling the coat down against her body. The sound of the river changes as it closes around her, muffling the world above, replacing it with a low, continuous hum. She feels the weight increase, the pockets filling, the pull steady and sure. The last thing she sees is the pale surface of the water folding over itself in small, shifting patterns, each one gone before it can be named. Back at the house, the rooms hold their stillness. On the desk, the pen remains where she left it, turned slightly toward the page as though it might resume the work in her absence. The letter rests where Leonard will find it, the ink dry, the folds neat. Outside, the air is unchanged, the path quiet, the hedges unbroken. The river moves on, carrying with it the stones, the coat, the body they anchor. Overhead, the sky brightens a little, a patch of blue opening briefly between clouds before closing again. The river moves onward, its current steady, untroubled by the weight it now carries. To the water, she is not an intrusion, but a joining. Another form entering its endless motion, another shape folded into its cold silken layers. The surface closes quickly over her, the ripples smoothing themselves as if nothing has passed this way at all. Only a faint swirl remains, a pale circle widening, then dissolving into the rest of the flow. The light above wavers, fractured by the shifting skin of the river. Sun and cloud alternate their claim on the sky, and each time the sun returns, its rays pierce the water in trembling columns, striking stones, roots, and the slow drift of leaves. The willows lean low over the bank, their branches brushing the current in soft arcs, stirring faint patterns that vanish before they can be named. From among their roots, reeds stand tall, their thin stalks bending to the breeze, while their submerged lengths sway gently in the darker, heavier flow. The river has seen this before, not her, not this coat lined with its careful weight, but other offerings, other small surrenders to its depth. Fish slide by, indifferent, their scales catching the shifting light for an instant before disappearing into shadow. A piece of bark spins lazily in an eddy near the shore. Somewhere upstream, the faint drip of water from a stone into the current sends out a rhythm too soft to travel far. From below, the world above is only suggestion, a rippling film of color and shadow. A pale blur might be sky, a darker one the underside of a branch, a fleeting shadow, perhaps a bird in flight. The sounds here are not the sounds of air and street, but of water speaking in its own tongue. The low murmur of the current, the muted thump of something dislodged along the bed, the faint hiss of bubbles rising. Time here is different. It does not divide itself into minutes or hours. It moves by the change of light, by the slow drift of objects passing, each carried forward, yet never arriving anywhere the river does not already hold. In this language, there is no past and future, only the continual folding of now into now. Above, the bank is empty. The path curves away, invisible from where the water flows, but the weight of footsteps still lingers faintly in the soft earth. A small insect skims the surface, its legs dimpling the water in brief, perfect circles. A twig drifts into the main current and is taken quickly, its movement swift, yet without struggle. The coat sinks further, the stones in its pockets settling against the riverbed. The current touches the fabric, lifts a fold, lets it fall again. Silt rises in slow clouds, pale against the darker bottom, before being drawn downstream in faint ribbons. The body becomes part of the river's own architecture now, a shape among stones and roots, its presence changing the flow in ways almost too subtle to see. The light shifts again. A thin beam pierces the surface, striking the smooth curve of a stone nearby, and for an instant, the entire riverbed seems to shimmer. Then a cloud passes, and the brightness fades, leaving only the muted green-brown of water at depth. A single leaf spins down from the bank, turns once on the surface, and is taken under by the smallest pull, its stem catching briefly on the coat before it moves on. Somewhere far off, a train crosses a bridge, its sound reaching the water as a distant, muffled thrum. The vibration touches the surface but does not disturb it, fading into the ongoing rhythm of current and wind. Above, the branches shift, scattering small points of light onto the surface, each one trembling before breaking apart. The river doesn't keep her. It carries, as it carries everything. Downstream, the flow widens, reeds give way to open banks, The sound of the current changes as the bed deepens. Her weight remains constant, but the water moves more freely now around her, tugging at the coat, smoothing her hair into the same direction as the flow. By the time the sun lowers toward afternoon, the willows on the bank cast longer shadows across the water. The breeze stirs their leaves into a soft rustle that the river hears only as a faint vibration against its surface. Insects drift in the light, and the occasional splash of a fish breaks the air before folding back into the water's skin. The day will go on this way, light and shadow trading places, the current holding and releasing in turn. And still, the river will carry her, not with urgency, but with the slow inevitability of something that has always known its course. There will be no announcement, no marker set upon the bank, only the widening, then the smoothing, then the ongoing motion of water, as it has been before her and will be after. Upstream, a pair of ducks drift into view, their bodies rocking lightly as they ride the current. They pass over the place where she lies without pause, their feet paddling in a slow rhythm, the faint wake behind them dissolving within moments. The river folds the disturbance back into its surface, the pattern gone as if it had never been. In time, its own kind of time, the stones, the coat, and the body they anchor will settle deeper, becoming part of the river's bed. The current will work its small changes, loosening, smoothing, covering. There will be no sudden transformation, only the ongoing folding of one form into another, the way the river makes everything part of itself. The willows lean closer to the water as the afternoon fades, their shadows stretching farther out across the current. The light is softer now, more gold than white, and the surface glimmers where it catches, breaking into small, restless pieces. The river moves on, carrying its hidden weight, its unseen history, toward the next bend. The river rounds the bend, its surface smoothing in the slack water before the next stretch of current. What it carries beneath is unseen, but the air above moves on as if nothing has altered. Birds crossing the sky with their usual arcs, the wind lifting the reeds in its quiet, patient way. In the house she left behind, the stillness is different. Leonard returns from the garden to find the letter waiting, the envelope turned so that her hand faces him before he even sits to read. The room is neat, her pen beside the inkwell, the faint scent of ink still hovering over the paper. He reads, the words sharp in their clarity, as though she had cut them from the air rather than written them. The noise of the world beyond the walls, neighboring voices, the occasional roll of a passing cart, fades as he moves through the letter. When it's finished, he sits very still, the paper resting in his lap, the edges trembling only slightly in his hands. There's no need to read it twice. The weight of it is already fixed in him. The hours that follow are not measured in the ordinary way. He moves through the house as one might walk through a landscape altered overnight, familiar and yet profoundly changed. Each room carries the trace of her, the books lined in careful rows, the chair angled toward the fire, the vase in which a few stems of early spring flowers still stand. None of these are louder than the silence between them. Friends arrive when the news reaches them, their faces holding that particular mixture of disbelief and recognition that comes when an absence confirms a long-feared truth. Vanessa comes, her presence at once grounding and unbearably close to the loss. Others follow, members of the circle that had once gathered in Bloomsbury rooms and gardens, their voices lowered as if the house itself must be kept from waking. In the days after, the river yields what it has kept. The form is brought home, and with it the finality that words on a page cannot soften. The funeral is quiet, attended by those who have known her in the shifting shapes of her life, sister, friend, colleague, writer. There is no public spectacle, no grand address, only the murmur of the service, the dull thud of earth, the slow dispersal of people into the cool air outside. And then, as the days move outward from that center, the work remains. The books stand on their shelves in other people's homes, in libraries, in the shops that still keep them despite shortages and war. Her words move without her now, crossing borders and oceans, slipping into the hands of strangers who read them in quiet rooms, on trains, in the small hours before sleep. Some read them as one might read a confidant's letter, others as a mirror in which their own thoughts take shape. Leonard tends to the press, to the business of her estate, to the careful preservation of the manuscripts. It is work that steadies him, though each page he handles carries its own shadow, He keeps the garden as she would have liked it, paths cleared, beds planted, the changing flowers marking the seasons even as the war continues overhead. In certain lights, the house feels unchanged. In others, it is unavoidably altered, as if the air has thinned. Her friends remember her in fragments, her quickness in conversation, the way her head would tilt slightly as she listened, the sudden, unexpected humor that could brighten even a serious discussion. Some recall the silences too, the days when she seemed to recede, her gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the room. These memories don't resolve into a single portrait. They remain as shifting and layered as her own writing. In the years that follow, the war ends, the city rebuilds, the streets fill again with people and noise. New books appear, new voices take their place in the public conversation, and yet her sentences continue to move through the world with their own quiet persistence. A line from To the Lighthouse, read by lamplight in a small flat. A passage from a room of one's own, underlined in a student's copy. A first encounter with Mrs Dalloway on a library shelf. The river itself goes on, carrying none of these traces, holding no visible sign of what it once bore. The willows over the bank put out their leaves each spring. The reeds sway in the same rhythm. The water folds over itself in endless renewal. Somewhere, perhaps, a passerby pauses on the path, looking out over its surface without knowing what lies in its history. And so, the echo of her life is not a single sound, but a continuing murmur, heard differently by each who comes to it. For some, it is the light in a certain sentence. For others, the shape of a thought that feels as if it had always been their own. It is not fixed in time, any more than the beam of a lighthouse is fixed. It sweeps across the dark, returns, sweeps again, touching a different place each time. In Leonard's later years, he will walk the path by the river alone, the same path she took that morning. He will stop at the bank, not to look for anything, but to stand in the air she once breathed, to listen to the water's low, unbroken speech. He does not speak aloud, but the pause itself feels like a kind of conversation. Elsewhere, in rooms she never entered, her books will rest on bedside tables, in the stacks of second-hand shops, on the desks of those who have just discovered them. The pages will open, the words will lift, the voices will speak again, and in that she will remain, not in the river's keeping, but in the minds that let her in. Some evenings, when the light slants low across the shelves, a reader somewhere will close one of her books and sit for a moment in the stillness it leaves behind. In that stillness, the echo lingers, soft, patient, unending.